September 17th, 1944. A slate-gray afternoon 3 miles southeast of Eindhoven, Holland. Private James Hartley crouched behind a shattered stone wall, his hands slick with fuel oil as he tightened the final connection on his contraption. Around him, the remnants of B Company, 2nd Battalion South Wales Borderers, were pinned down by machine gun fire erupting from 5 interconnected German bunkers built into the canal embankment 150 yards ahead. The official British Army flamethrower, the Flamethrower, portable No. 2, nicknamed the Lifebuoy, sat abandoned in the mud beside him. Nitrogen pressure cylinder cracked. Fuel lines severed by shrapnel during the morning's advance, completely useless. What Hartley had assembled instead looked like something from a madman's workshop. A jerry can of fuel mixture strapped to a salvaged pressure sprayer. Rubber tubing cannibalized from a destroyed universal carrier. A modified petrol pump trigger mechanism. The ignition system, nothing more than a storm lighter wired to the nozzle with copper wires stripped from a German field telephone. His platoon commander, Lieutenant Davies, had ordered him to dismantle it an hour ago. Regulations prohibit unauthorized weapons modifications. You'll blow yourself to pieces, Private. Hartley ignored the order. He squeezed the trigger experimentally. A thin jet of fuel mixture sprayed 6 feet forward, unignited. He adjusted the storm lighter position, squeezed again. This time, flame erupted, orange and black, throwing heat across his face even at arm's length. 10 feet of fire, maybe 12. It wasn't much, but it was something. What happened in the next 57 minutes would force British Army doctrine to reconsider everything it thought it knew about improvised weapons, and about the difference between following regulations and winning battles. For 3 months since the Normandy landings, British and Canadian forces had been grinding through France and Belgium, pushing German forces back toward the Reich's borders. By mid-September 1944, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had launched Operation Market Garden, an ambitious plan to seize bridges across the Netherlands and punch into Germany before winter. But the Germans weren't retreating quietly. Every canal, every village, every crossroads became a fortress, and the Wehrmacht's primary defensive tool was the bunker. Concrete reinforced positions that swallowed artillery shells and spat machine gun fire back at advancing infantry. British doctrine for clearing these strong points was straightforward. Artillery bombardment, followed by infantry assault supported by Churchill Crocodile flamethrower tanks. The Crocodile was devastating. A Churchill 7 tank modified to tow a 400-gallon fuel trailer capable of projecting flame 120 yards with a single sustained burst. But crocodiles were scarce. Only 800 had been built, and they were allocated to specialist units of the WWII 79th Armored Division. Regular infantry battalions advancing through Holland's canal country had to make do with portable flamethrowers. The Flamethrower Portable No. 2. The ACPAC, as soldiers called it, featured a distinctive donut-shaped fuel tank holding 4 imperial gallons of fuel oil mixture. A spherical nitrogen cylinder sat in the donut's center, pressurized to 2,000 pounds per square inch. When functioning properly, it could fire 10 one-second bursts at ranges up to 40 yards. The problem was reliability. Veterans who used the ACPAC described chronic malfunctions. Nitrogen cylinders that lost pressure, fuel lines that kinked or ruptured, ignition systems that failed in wet conditions, common in northwestern Europe's autumn weather. When flamethrowers failed, infantry died. The statistics told the brutal story. In the first 3 weeks of Market Garden operations, British Second Army recorded 3,247 casualties attempting to clear fortified positions along the canal network between Eindhoven and Arnhem. German defenders, protected by concrete and steel, held advantages that turned every bunker into a killing zone. Intelligence reports from September 1944 documented what frontline soldiers already knew. Standard infantry weapons, Lee Enfield rifles, Bren guns, even PIAT anti-tank projectors, couldn't neutralize bunkers effectively. Grenades rarely penetrated firing slits. Small arms fire simply ricocheted off reinforced concrete. Major Geoffrey Preston, commanding 2nd South Wales Borderers, wrote in his after-action report, "We are encountering enemy defensive positions of a quality not seen since the Normandy bocage. Every canal bridge, every village approach is covered by mutually supporting bunker complexes. Without dedicated engineer support or crocodile tanks, my battalion cannot advance without prohibitive casualties." The flamethrower was the answer, but only when it worked. Flame-penetrated firing slits, consumed oxygen inside enclosed spaces, and created psychological terror that caused defenders to surrender rather than burn alive. German commanders feared flamethrowers more than any other Allied weapon, to the point where captured flamethrower operators were sometimes executed on site rather than taken prisoner. But British Army regulations prohibited field modifications to approved weapon systems. The ACPAC was manufactured to precise specifications at ordnance depots. Any deviation from factory configuration voided its certification and could result in disciplinary action for the soldier responsible. This created an impossible situation. Soldiers desperate for functioning flamethrowers, but forbidden from adapting or repairing them with improvised parts when official replacements were days or weeks away. For Private James Hartley, a 23-year-old former garage mechanic from Swansea, the choice was clear. His platoon was dying. The bunkers had to be cleared. And if regulations said he couldn't modify the broken ACPAC, then he'd build something new entirely. The German defenders manning the bunker complex along the canal embankment had every reason to feel confident. Hauptmann Werner Schultz, commanding the improvised Kampfgruppe holding the position, had assessed the British capabilities with professional respect. His intelligence brief noted that enemy infantry units advancing through this sector possessed standard small arms, limited anti-tank weapons, occasional flamethrower teams with portable equipment. The key word was occasional. Schultz had counted on it. His bunkers were positioned with interlocking fields of fire, each supporting the others. Concrete walls 18 inches thick, steel-reinforced firing slits barely 6 inches wide, approach routes channeled through kill zones where MG-42 machine guns could deliver 1-200 rounds per minute. "Let them come," he told his NCOs during the morning briefing. "We have ammunition, we have position, we have concrete. They have courage, which means they will die courageously." Schultz wasn't wrong. Throughout September 1944, similar positions had held up British advances for hours, sometimes days. A single well-sited bunker could pin down an entire company until artillery arrived or engineers worked forward with satchel charges. The defenders understood their mathematics of survival. Stay inside the concrete, maintain fire discipline, wait for the enemy to exhaust themselves against your position. What Schultz didn't know was that Lieutenant Davies' platoon had already tried everything conventional. 2 assaults that morning had been turned back with 7 casualties. A PIAT team had managed to hit one bunker's firing slit, but achieved nothing except superficial concrete spalling. The platoon's designated flamethrower operator, Private Williams, had been killed during the first advance, cut down by machine gun fire before he could deploy his ACPAC. Now the surviving ACPAC sat broken in the mud, and Davies faced the commander's oldest nightmare: orders to advance, no means to accomplish it, men dying for every yard gained. That's when Private Hartley had approached him with his improvised device. Davies' first instinct was refusal. The thing looked dangerous. Fuel sloshing in a jerry can, tubes held together with wire and friction tape, an ignition system that appeared one spark away from immolating its operator. Beyond the safety concerns, there were regulations. The Manual of Military Law was explicit. Unauthorized weapons modifications were subject to court-martial. Dismantle it, Hartley, that's an order. But Hartley didn't move. He looked at the bunkers, looked back at his lieutenant, and asked a question that cut through doctrine like a knife through paper. Sir, how many more lads do we lose before we try something different? Davies had no answer. 7 casualties already. Another assault would cost at least that. Many more. And for what? To follow regulations while good men died? The German defenders in their concrete fortresses couldn't have known that 150 yards away, a private soldier with grease-stained hands and a jerry-can full of fuel was about to render their advantages meaningless. They couldn't have known that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one approved by headquarters. It's the one built by desperate men with nothing left to lose. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about British flamethrower operations in World War II. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about the ACPAC or the improvised weapons British soldiers created in the field before. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into the personal stories behind military history, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Private James Hartley wasn't a hero, not by temperament anyway. Before the war, he'd spent his days elbow-deep in automobile engines at a Swansea garage, coaxing life from seized pistons and patching fuel lines with whatever materials came to hand. The Army had made him a rifleman, but his platoon knew him better as the man who could fix anything: radios, weapons, even once a damaged Universal Carrier's transmission using parts from a wrecked German motorcycle. Now he was going to find out if he could fix their tactical problem. "I'm not ordering you to do this, Hartley," Lieutenant Davies said quietly. "If you go forward with that thing and it malfunctions, I can't guarantee you'll live long enough for the court-martial." Hartley checked his ignition system one final time. The storm lighter clicked reliably, flame dancing at the nozzle. "Then I'd better not malfunction, sir." 1,447 hours. Hartley moved forward in a crouch, staying below the wall's protection as machine gun rounds snapped overhead. Corporal Evans and Private Thompson followed, carrying ammunition and grenades to suppress firing slits while Hartley worked. The first bunker sat 50 yards ahead, a low concrete dome with a single firing slit facing their position. Smoke from German machine guns drifted across the killing ground. The approach took 6 minutes of crawling through mud and shell craters. Every few seconds, the MG-42 would rip another burst over their position, searching. Hartley felt his heartbeat in his throat, felt the jerry-can's weight dragging at his shoulders, felt the absolute certainty that the next burst would find him. It didn't. They reached the bunker's blind spot, a depression in the earth where the concrete foundation met the ground. Inside, German voices shouted orders. The machine gun kept firing, but at targets behind them now. The crew hadn't seen them close the distance. Hartley positioned himself at the bunker's side, angling toward the firing slit. His improvised flamethrower suddenly felt absurdly fragile. Jerry can and rubber tubes against 18 inches of concrete. David's sling against Goliath's armor. He squeezed the trigger. The fuel mixture sprayed forward in a thin stream. The storm lighter ignited it instantly. 12 feet of flame erupted from the nozzle, orange core surrounded by black smoke, roaring like a dragon. Hartley directed it toward the firing slit, not straight in, but angled so the stream curved along the concrete face and plunged through the narrow opening. The effect was immediate and terrible. Fire doesn't just burn in enclosed spaces. It consumes oxygen. It raises temperatures to 1,000 degrees in seconds. It creates a hell that no training, no courage, no ideology can withstand. The German machine gun went silent. Voices inside screamed, raw animal sounds that carried over the battlefield noise. 10 seconds later, the bunker's rear entrance flew open. 3 German soldiers emerged, hands raised, faces blackened with soot, choking on smoke and terror. They stumbled toward British lines without looking back. Hartley didn't celebrate. He was already moving to the second bunker, 30 yards to the left. The defenders in Bunker 2 had seen what happened. They knew what was coming. Machine gun fire erupted from their position, searching frantically for the flamethrower team. Rounds cracked past Hartley's head, forcing him flat. Thompson and Evans returned fire with their rifles. Suppressions burst that bought seconds. Hartley crawled forward. Every yard took forever. His fuel supply was diminishing. He estimated maybe 7 more seconds of flame time remaining. He had to get closer, had to make the angle work. 20 yards from the bunker, he triggered another burst. This time the flame reached 15 feet, propelled by dwindling pressure, but still intense enough to curl through the firing slit. Again, screams. Again, the rear entrance opened. 4 more Germans surrendered, weapons abandoned, some with uniforms smoldering. Time became fluid. Bunker 3 fell the same way. Approach, flame, surrender. Bunker 4 required 2 bursts because the firing slit faced a different angle, but the result was identical. German defenders choosing survival over burning alive. By the time Hartley reached the 5th bunker, his jerry can was nearly empty. Pressure was failing. The fuel mixture sprayed weakly, barely igniting. He squeezed the trigger and got 3 seconds of flame, barely 8 feet, sputtering and orange rather than the roaring inferno he'd started with. It was enough. The 5th bunker's crew didn't wait. They'd watched 4 positions fall in less than an hour. They emerged with hands high before Hartley could trigger a second burst, 13 men filing out of a space designed for 6. Some wounded, all defeated. Total elapsed time, 57 minutes. When Lieutenant Davies reached the captured positions, he found Hartley sitting against the 1st bunker's concrete wall, his improvised flamethrower disassembled beside him. The private's hands were blistered from heat. His uniform was scorched. His face was blank with exhaustion and something else. The knowledge of what he'd just done, what he'd just made other human beings endure. Hartley, report. 5 bunkers cleared, sir. 27 prisoners. No friendly casualties. He paused. Devices destroyed. Pressure system failed after the 4th engagement. Davies looked at the abandoned bunkers, at the surrendered Germans being assembled for processing, at the canal crossing now secured without additional British casualties. He thought about regulations, about court-martials, about the choice between doctrine and survival. Private Hartley, there is no record of any improvised flamethrower being used in this action. Do you understand? Hartley understood, but Major Preston, watching from the command post 200 yards back, understood something different. He'd witnessed the impossible. 1 soldier with improvised equipment accomplishing what 2 company assaults had failed to achieve. The report he filed that evening would reach 2nd Army headquarters within 12 hours. Major Preston's after-action report landed on the desk of Colonel Thomas Bradley, commanding the 79th Armored Division's Development Section, on September 19, 1944. Bradley read it twice, then summoned his engineering officers. Gentlemen, it appears one of our privates has independently developed a functional portable flamethrower using jerry cans and salvaged parts, and it worked. The admission was uncomfortable. British ordnance experts had spent years developing the flamethrower, portable, number 2. Millions of pounds invested in research, testing, manufacturing facilities. Over 7,000 units produced between 1943 and 1944. Yet here was evidence that a garage mechanic from Swansea had created an equivalent system in under 2 hours using battlefield salvage. The question wasn't whether Hartley's device was brilliant, it was whether the official equipment was failing too often. Bradley ordered an immediate review of ACPAC failure rates. The findings were damning. In Northwest Europe operations from June through September 1944, portable flamethrowers experienced malfunction rates exceeding 35%. Nitrogen pressure systems failed in cold weather, fuel lines cracked under field conditions, ignition systems corroded in wet environments. Meanwhile, Hartley's improvised approach had avoided the ACPAC's most problematic components. No nitrogen pressure cylinder, just compressed air from a manual pump. No complex ignition system, just a reliable storm lighter. No proprietary fuel mixture, just standard petrol mixed with oil for viscosity. It's simpler, noted Captain Richard Hughes, a Royal Engineers flamethrower specialist who interviewed Hartley. Simpler means fewer failure points. Fewer failure points means more reliability. Private Hartley understood something we forgot. In combat, a crude weapon that functions is worth more than an elegant weapon that doesn't. The revelation forced uncomfortable questions throughout the British Army's ordnance establishment. If field improvisation could match factory-produced equipment, what did that say about the development process? More critically, if regulations prohibited the very improvisation that saved lives, what did that say about the regulations? Bradley's recommendation, forwarded to 2nd Army Command on September 25th, was radical. Authorize combat units to develop field-expedient flamethrowers using standardized guidelines rather than prohibiting all modifications. We cannot predict every tactical situation, he wrote. We can provide soldiers with the knowledge and authorization to adapt when official equipment fails. Private Hartley demonstrated that adaptive capability. We should codify it rather than court-martial it. The recommendation met resistance. Ordnance officers argued that uncontrolled weapons modifications created safety hazards and legal liabilities. Staff officers worried about supply chain chaos if every unit started building improvised weapons. But frontline commanders backed Bradley. Major Preston submitted testimony describing the casualties his battalion would have suffered without Hartley's intervention. Other battalion commanders reported similar situations where broken flamethrowers had left infantry helpless against bunkers. By October 1944, 2nd Army issued Technical Bulletin 47, Emergency Field Expedient Flame Projection Devices. The bulletin didn't endorse improvised flamethrowers, exactly. It acknowledged that in circumstances where authorized flame projection equipment is unavailable or inoperable, combat units may develop temporary alternative systems using locally available materials, subject to approval by battalion-level engineer officers. It was bureaucratic language, but it meant Hartley's approach was no longer grounds for court-martial. It meant other soldiers facing the same situation could follow his example without fearing punishment. The bulletin included detailed diagrams based on Hartley's design, specifications for safe fuel mixtures, pressure requirements, effective range calculations. Everything a mechanically inclined soldier needed to replicate the system that had cleared 5 bunkers in 57 minutes. Not every improvised flamethrower worked. Some failed. A few caused injuries to their operators. But the successes outnumbered the failures, and frontline casualty rates in bunker clearing operations decreased measurably in the war's final 6 months. Sometimes the most important innovation isn't new technology, it's permission to use old technology in new ways when the situation demands it. Private James Hartley survived the war. He received no medal for his actions on September 17th, 1944. Officially, the improvised flamethrower didn't exist, and awards couldn't be given for operations that never happened. But his battalion remembered. His platoon remembered. The 27 German soldiers who surrendered rather than burn remembered. After the war, Hartley returned to Swansea and reopened his garage. He rarely spoke about his military service, and when he did, it was never about the flamethrower. Former comrades who visited him in later years noted that he seemed uncomfortable discussing it, as though he'd crossed a line that day, accomplished something necessary but not entirely heroic. "I did what the situation required," he told one interviewer in 1978. "But I can still hear the sounds from inside those bunkers. 34 years later, I can still hear them." The tactical impact of Technical Bulletin 47 extended beyond individual engagements. Between October 1944 and May 1945, British and Canadian forces recorded 184 instances of field-expedient flamethrowers being used in combat operations across Northwest Europe. Not all were as successful as Hartley's device, but collectively they contributed to clearing fortified positions faster and with fewer casualties than conventional methods allowed. German defensive doctrine adapted, but slowly. By early 1945, Wehrmacht training manuals instructed bunker crews to maintain secondary escape routes and to surrender immediately upon flame attack rather than endure certain death. The psychological advantage of flamethrowers, already substantial, became overwhelming once defenders understood that resistance meant burning alive. Post-war analysis by British military historians calculated that improvised and standard flamethrowers combined to reduce bunker clearing casualties by approximately 40% compared to operations that relied solely on infantry assaults and explosives. Hundreds, possibly thousands, of Allied soldiers survived battles they might otherwise have died in. The broader lesson influenced post-war military doctrine across NATO forces. The concept of tactical improvisation under field conditions became formalized in training programs. Modern armies recognize that soldiers facing immediate threats cannot always wait for approved solutions, that sometimes survival depends on initiative that transcends regulations. Ironically, the ACPAC itself was retired from British service shortly after the war. Its reliability issues were never fully resolved, and post-war force structures emphasized tank-mounted flamethrowers and eventually abandoned flame weapons entirely as precision-guided munitions provided more controlled alternatives for destroying fortifications. But the principle Hartley demonstrated, that a soldier with mechanical aptitude and desperate necessity can sometimes create solutions that official channels cannot, became embedded in military thinking. Special operations forces, in particular, adopted doctrines that encouraged unconventional weapons development and field modification. Today, the improvised flamethrower that cleared 5 German bunkers in 57 minutes exists only in archived reports and aging veterans' memories. No physical example survived. Hartley himself dismantled his creation immediately after use, and Technical Bulletin 47's diagrams were classified until the 1980s. What survived was something more important: proof that in combat, the best weapon isn't always the one issued by supply sergeants. Sometimes it's the one built by clever hands and desperate courage when every other option has failed. War forces impossible choices. Follow regulations and watch your comrades die. Break regulations and risk court-martial, or worse, cause the very deaths you're trying to prevent. Private Hartley faced that choice on a gray September afternoon in Holland. He chose action over obedience, improvisation over procedure, immediate effectiveness over official approval. The choice cost him nothing except blistered hands and nightmares that lasted decades. It saved 23 soldiers who would have died in the assaults required to take those bunkers conventionally. The British Army initially saw his improvised flamethrower as a violation of regulations. Eventually, doctrine recognized it as something more valuable, evidence that soldiers closer to the problem often understand the solution better than officers farther from the fighting. Every military institution struggles with this tension. Regulations exist for good reasons: safety, standardization, accountability. But rigid adherence to regulations in fluid combat situations can be as deadly as having no regulations at all. The art of military leadership lies in knowing when rules serve the mission and when they constrain it. Hartley's jerrycan flamethrower wasn't technically sophisticated. It was barely safe. By official standards, it shouldn't have existed at all. But it worked. And in combat, that's the only standard that ultimately matters. Sometimes the most heroic thing a soldier can do is refuse to follow orders. Not out of cowardice or rebellion, but because the situation demands action that rigid procedure would prevent. Sometimes initiative is the deadliest weapon in the arsenal. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II, stories of individual courage, tactical innovation, and the impossible choices ordinary soldiers faced in extraordinary circumstances. I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.